Hi, I'm Professor Mark Grabowski, and this brief video lecture will address visual aids and using them in speeches. This video will talk about when to use visual aids, why to use visual aids, what types of visual aids to use, and how to use them. The nerves that lead from the eye to the brain are many times larger than those leading from the ear. And science tells us that we give 25 times as much attention to eye suggestions as we do to ear suggestions. One seeing, says an old Japanese proverb, is better than 100 times telling about it. So, if you wish to be clear, picture your points and visualize your ideas. In other words, use visual aids when giving a speech. Visual aids are particularly useful when you're giving an informative or demonstrative speech. In fact, if you're in my public speaking class, they are required when you give your informative or demonstrative speech. They may also come in handy later in the semester when you do your group panel discussions, but there are also some times when visual aids are kind of more of a nuisance or inconvenience than a help. When we do our persuasive speeches, for example, those will only be 2 minutes long, and it just won't be practical to incorporate a visual aid into that speech. The same thing when you're doing your debates. You won't be using a visual aid for that speech. But for the informative speeches and demonstrative speeches, you not only want to use a visual aid, you are required to use a visual aid. So let's talk about that. There are all types of different visual aids that you can use in your informative and demonstrative speech. Students usually use a PowerPoint presentation. Some people also use photos, or they may incorporate photos into their PowerPoint presentation. I've also seen students use posters. If you're doing a demonstrative speech and teaching us how to cook a pie or brownies or something like that, then cooking materials, the actual materials that are needed to bake whatever it is you're showing the class how to bake, would make sense. Sometimes people also use human volunteers as visual aids. For example, if you're demonstrating how to give the Heimlich maneuver or how to perform CPR, it might make sense to use a volunteer. Just be careful that you do not hurt them. You might want to consider using a dummy doll instead. So you can use any of these I mentioned or something entirely different, but make sure that you use at least one type of visual aid in your speech. If you don't have a visual aid when you do your demonstrative or informative speech, you will lose points. Okay, now let's go over some tips for using your visual aids in your speeches. First tip is to keep the exhibit out of sight until you're ready to use it. People can easily be distracted by visual aids. You don't want that to happen. You want them to be paying attention to you and to what you're saying. So if you have visual aids, especially if it's a very colorful poster or something like that, don't bring it out until you're actually ready to use it in your speech. Otherwise, your audience might not pay attention to you. They'll just be preoccupied by the visual aid. An exception would be if you have an exhibit that lends itself to the mystery treatment. What I would suggest in that case would have it placed on the table, which will be located at the side when you speak. Have it covered as you talk. Make references to it that will arouse curiosity, but don't tell the audience what it is. Then, when you're ready to unveil it, you have aroused curiosity, suspense, and real interest. But unless you're giving an object the mystery treatment, just kind of keep it out of the audience's sight if possible until you need to use it. Now, regardless of when you plan to show your visual aid, whether it's at the beginning of your speech or later on in the middle of the speech, make sure that it is queued up and ready to go. So if you're showing a poster, make sure that it's not covered by like a plastic bag or whatever. Likewise, if you're going to show us a clip on YouTube, make sure that that's queued up on the computer and ready to go, and that the projection screen is on and all of that stuff. You don't want to be fumbling around doing a search on YouTube in the middle of your speech looking for a video. Remember, this is a timed speech, so every second counts. If you're fumbling around trying to get your visual aid queued up, you're going to lose precious time, and in the long run you could end up going over the time limit and lose points. Plus, it's just a distraction to the audience when you kind of have that sort of interruption where you're trying to find your video on YouTube, or where you're fumbling with your visual aid to get it prepared to show to the audience. The next tip is to use exhibits large enough to be seen from the very last row. And that's because certainly your audience can't learn from any exhibit unless they can see it. This is especially important if you're using anything other than a PowerPoint. If you're using a PowerPoint, then you can use the projection screen, and everyone in the class will probably be able to see it. But I've seen many students use things like posters, for example, and they write fairly large print, but it's not large enough that someone in the back row can read it. So keep that in mind, that people perhaps as far as 30 feet away may have to may be looking at your poster or your visual aid. So make sure that it's clear and can be clearly read and understood by someone who is sitting that far away. Next tip, avoid passing an exhibit around among your listeners. And the reason for that is it's going to cause a lot of distraction in the audience. First, when they interrupt the person behind them or next to them to actually pass around the object. And secondly, if they're looking at the object and checking it out, they're not going to be listening to your speech. They're going to be distracted. You don't want to create competition between a handout and your speech. So if possible, try to avoid using an exhibit that's going to involve passing it around to everyone in the class. When you show an exhibit, unless it's something like a PowerPoint, which is going to be displayed on a fixed screen, if possible, hold it up where your listeners can see it. Remember, different people have different vantage points. Someone may be stuck behind a tall person, and they may not have a clear view of the object that you're showing at the front of the room on your tripod. So if possible, it's a good idea to show it up high to ensure that everyone in the audience is able to see what you're talking about. Perhaps you've seen those game shows like The Price is Right, or something like that, where they have the different models go and walk around on stage, or even through the audience, sort of holding up high, displaying prizes they're giving away. You want to do something similar like that when you speak and use your exhibit. The next tip is, don't stare at the exhibit as you talk. You are trying to communicate with the audience, not with the exhibit. So you kind of want to be like a weatherman, or a weather woman. You know how on TV, when you watch the weather forecast on the evening news, they've got a screen behind them, and they'll be using their hands to point at where the weather is or the different problems, but their face will be facing the camera, speaking towards you, the audience. You want to be the same way with your exhibit. You want to, be pointing to it and gesturing towards it, perhaps even holding it up, but you want to be looking directly at the audience as much as possible, not speaking to the exhibit or the weather map. And after you've finished using the exhibit, get it out of sight if possible. This goes back to this whole idea of not wanting to create competition between you and your exhibit. So if you don't need the exhibit anymore, then get it out of sight. Otherwise, people might continue to stare at it, and if they're staring at it, they're paying attention to the exhibit itself, not to you and to what you're saying, and you don't want that to happen. You want your audience to be listening to you. Next tip is, don't overdo it with your exhibit. A long succession of charts is usually boring. If you make a diagram as you go along, be careful to sketch roughly and as swiftly on the blackboard or flip chart as possible. Listeners are not interested in great artwork. Use abbreviations, write largely and legibly. Keep talking as you draw or write, and keep turning back to your audience. If you're using a video such as a clip from YouTube, you want to keep it short, no more than like a minute. What I don't want to see is a 4-minute video clip and then you speaking for only a minute or two. If you do that, you're going to lose a lot of points. You should be speaking for a majority of the time. You shouldn't be relying on a video or something like that to fill out your speech. Rather, your visual aid should be used to complement your speech. And as with all of your speeches, you need to practice using your visual aid beforehand. So when you practice your informative speech or demonstrative speech, don't just run through the speech itself. You also want to practice using the visual aid and practice several times. Practice in a mirror if you can. Practice in front of people so they can give you feedback. Because if you're using the visual aid for the first time when you get up in front of the class to give your speech, it's probably not going to go too well. You're going to end up doing things like talking to the visual aid instead of talking to the audience, and that will cost you points. So it's really important that you practice with your visual aid. Practice makes perfect, and will also make you more confident when you get up to speak. Okay, so that is how to use a visual aid in a nutshell. Told you it was going to be a brief presentation. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to email me at mark.grabowski@marist.edu.